Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Your glance at sex and social justice.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peep Show podcast. We have a great show for you. Sex worker, activist, and writer Lorelei Lee will be joining us. We talk to her about being out as a sex worker, combating stigma, and building friendships within the sex worker community. But first, Julian Gill-Peterson, author of Histories of the Transgender Child, joins us for our news segment to discuss the Trump administration's recent memo instructing government agencies to no longer recognize trans identities.
Hi everyone, joining us for today's news segment we have Julian Gill-Peterson. Julian is an assistant professor of English and gender, sexuality, and women's studies at the University of Pittsburgh. They are the author of Histories of the Transgender Child, which was just released.
Yeah, when did your book come out?
Well, it sort of came out last week, but as I understand it, people have actually started to receive copies they've ordered now. So we'll call it real today.
Oh, that's so nice. So this is very timely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had you on like a lot of episodes ago. I can't even remember exactly when, to talk about this when it was forthcoming, and now it's here.
Yeah, it's wild to think that. I mean, it's been a long process in bringing it to fruition, so I generally measure the book in super long increments of time anyways, but glad to have it finally be out in the world.
Can you just give our listeners a brief overview of what your book's about?
Of course, yeah. So the book is very much like the title sort of suggests, a set of histories of transgender children really across the 20th century. So during a time period in which we really haven't had much in the way of any kind of historical information about the experiences and lives of trans kids. And I focus in particular on their experiences with medicalization, with doctors and with researchers, and look at how a lot of our core concepts of gender, sexuality, and biological sex actually came out of experiments on trans kids as well as intersex kids, and use that sort of as a launching point for thinking about how we can better stand up for and defend trans kids today, since one of the main ways that they are often under attack is through the idea that today's trans kids are somehow the very first ones in history and are unprecedented. And so really the big aim of the book is to show that that's not true and to offer a kind of counter history that we've sort of been waiting for.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great project. I actually will just interject real quick and say that I sent some of the students in my class to a talk that you gave about this, and they were so amazed to hear that history. They came back so excited to have heard about this history of trans kids, and they wanted to have a conversation about your work and about the fact that their friends, their trans friends, and the people in their communities aren't alone and aren't the first ones to have transitioned as young people.
Yeah, that's, to be honest, that is the most amazing kind of feedback that I could hear. I mean, I have to say, I feel the same way myself. Having trans history available is now more than ever, certainly, something that can provide context, but also a different kind of reassurance to know that you're not the first person to go through something, or our community is not going through this for the first time. And, one of my hopes for this book, even though it's an academic title, so it might not be the most readable by all audiences, but nonetheless that, producing this knowledge and putting it out into the world makes it more available to people who might be happy and excited to discuss it and discover it.
Mm-hmm. And actually, that's a fairly good segue into why we really wanted to talk to you this week in particular, because the memo just came out from the White House about the desire to do away with gender as a category. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what the implications of that is.
Yeah, it kind of took a lot of us, not by surprise, but nonetheless was, we're still sort of shaken up by it. I'm not a legal expert or policy expert, but from my understanding of the memo, which is sort of a proposal in the sense that it hasn't been enacted yet, but the proposal from U.S. Health and Human Services would be essentially to redefine gender or gender identity based exclusively and only on sex assigned at birth. So the medical sex assignment that people receive at birth that goes on their birth certificate, which is 99 times out of 100 accomplished by only the most cursory inspection. Right. Genitals, or perhaps already had been decided at an earlier point in the pregnancy through ultrasound or some other kind of imaging. It's a very anachronistic definition of gender. In fact, it proposes to define gender not through gender at all, but through a certain idea of what biological sex might be boiled down to. And then I think the second key component to it is that this definition has a very specific purpose. It's to make gender markers unchangeable for federal administrative purposes, right? So the way that it's really aimed against trans folks, non-binary folks, and intersex folks is that if this were implemented, it would prevent anyone from modifying any documentation or accessing any services through their actual gender identity if it is different from the one that was assigned when they were born. So that's sort of, I think that's the 1-2 punch there together.
Right.
That amounts to a total blockage of access to probably millions of people in a pretty vital area of federal services and government business.
Part of what that definition seems to do is to just totally erase the children that you're talking about in your book and their experiences. It seems to not even acknowledge that they exist.
Yeah, I think that was part of the fear and the anger that was provoked in a lot of people when, the memo was leaked. And that was sort of part of, I think that was the New York Times headline that characterized it that way, that this is sort of an attempt to erase trans folks in particular by redefining them out of existence was sort of the catchphrase. I tend to agree with, I think, a lot of the response from the community, which is to say, for all the power that the state or the government has, it doesn't have the power to define people's existence. And so whether they're a bureaucratic category or not, you can't make trans people or gender nonconforming people or non-binary people or intersex people go away because, in fact, they are not created out of language. They're people, human beings that exist in the world. But it really does seem like that's sort of the animus behind it. And there's obviously a much larger anti-trans political movement and backlash, or really just lash. I'm not sure it's totally a backlash that's been going on for quite a few years, converging with the way that trans visibility is at perhaps its highest point in a very long time. So this memo to me has something in common with bathroom bills, with the kind of fighting over locker rooms and any other public space. And it seems to be that the overall push here is to try and push trans people out of the public arena altogether. And that really is what HHS has a purview to do, right? The state really does have a lot of power in regulating public space, and people's access to public space, of course, is dependent upon their ability to get work, find housing, and get their basic necessities met.
Along those lines, I wonder if it's going to have particularly cruel consequences for intersex children. I wonder if this sort of hyper emphasis on sex being determined at birth is going to put renewed pressure on parents and doctors to do surgery at birth for intersex children, which I think we've actually started to move away from as society, pressuring those sorts of genital surgeries. But if we're going to fix binary sex in stone at birth, it seems like one of the consequences of that would be then to pressure parents and doctors into going through with those surgeries at birth.
I think you're completely right about that, and it's a really awful prospect. I mean, one of the things I can say from having, spent a long time looking at and researching, where does the sex binary sort of come from over the last 100 years? How does it get created by medicine, and how does that migrate into legal and political policy realms, right? The frustrating thing is, of course, the binary is really easy to pick apart. It's not a very good binary, right? I mean, it's just true that human beings are not divisible into two sexes or two genders. And actually, there's no test in existence anywhere in the world that can determine sex as one or the other in a binary. So, chromosomal tests can't do that. So genetic testing can't do that. Certainly, genital inspection cannot do that, right? And there was some suggestion in this memo or in the coverage of it that one of the methods of enforcement would actually be either genital inspection or genetic testing of the population, that's a really extreme invasion of privacy by the state. Just like you said, there are already some people who have very, very little right to bodily integrity, and those are certainly children, and intersex kids probably are in the worst position there because oftentimes that medical model intervenes without their knowledge or consent or before they're even old enough to make those kinds of decisions. One of the remedies that would fix this and prevent it from ever happening again would be if sex and gender weren't administrative axes, if they weren't things that we allowed the state to intrude on and regulate in our own lives, if they were left to individuals to designate, and if the government had to, or the state had to explain what is the purpose of collecting this data, what is the purpose of classifying people into these categories, right? Mm-hmm. And what is the reasonable justification for doing so?
Right. And also, sex and gender are historically fluid categories. So even when you do fix labels or categories in an institution at a particular point in time, society will change, and sex and gender will change along with it. Inevitably, those institutional definitions fall behind. But my perception, and I think it's along the lines of what you're saying, is that clearly on a base level, these policies are being driven by animus towards trans people and ignorance of intersex people, I think. But on a broader level, I think these policies are also about authority and frustration on the part of a certain more conservative part of our population that sees a cultural shift away from imbuing doctors, churches, policymakers with the authority to make these sorts of determinations over people's lives regarding sex and gender, and kind of decentering that more towards individuals and validating individuals' own experiences of their bodies, their gender, their sex. And to me, I think a big part of what this move seems to be about is trying to reconsolidate authority into traditional institutions and away from individuals.
Yeah, and you can, again, sort of think about how we're living through this moment where diverse genders and sexualities of all types have never been more visible to the wider populace, historically.
Right.
Since, the further you go back in time, the more likely folks that we might call today as queer or trans or non-binary tended to live somewhat more subcultural lives and to have really vibrant social worlds that they lived in, but that weren't necessarily always visible to everyone else around them or in the public, with certain exceptions. But we're sort of living at a moment where, you can turn on the TV or especially, go look at the news online or be on social media, and you have more access to different conceptions of gender and sexuality than, even we did. Really, take any measure you want, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, 20, et cetera. And so that seems to have really provoked a lot of motivation for folks to really turn to more punitive and powerful institutions to try and clamp down on that. And so, I've certainly been thinking about all of these incredible kids and young people out there redefining gender itself and living openly and transitioning in different ways and being spokespersons for themselves and their communities. And a lot of them have, I think, really led the charge in, providing a response to this memo in a really beautiful way by just stating that, that won't work. We're already here. We won't be erased. And sort of speaking from a position within the community or from within their own experience where they already have the knowledge and the certainty that they need. And that's not really something that can be taken away by the state, even if access to really vital institutions can be mitigated or taken away. You can't actually accomplish the erasure of people through redefinition.
Yeah, this actually reminds me a lot of the last conversation that we had when we were talking about this from the perspective of the medical establishment. And I really clearly remember you talking then about the fact that trans folks don't need doctors to affirm their identity. They're already doing that. Trans folks often desire to have medical treatment or hormonal treatment or surgical treatment, but that's not necessary for them just to exist in their identity. And it sounds like one of the things that you're saying here also kind of parallels that with governmental institutions, that they can't erase trans people's identity, but they can certainly prevent some freedoms of ways of negotiating that or accessing services.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, I can only speak for myself in this, but I think it sort of gets back to a point I was making earlier that we can and we should. And I've been happy to see some of the professional medical associations step up to do some of this work, since it's what they do anyways. This proposal can be debunked. You can show how it is illogical, how it has no foundation in any data-driven reality or any peer-reviewed scientific or medical research, and that it really is just plucked out of a very obvious political strategy. But at the same time, I've also been thinking about the ways in which spending time trying to deconstruct or debunk might not be the best place to spend our time, because it gives more platform to those folks who want to keep putting a question mark over the existence of anyone who's not straight and cisgender. One can spend time doing that, and I certainly do in my own work. But sometimes it's also helpful just to stop and say, no, we have absolutely nothing to defend on our side of this. We are not going to explain our existence. We're not going to have a debate over existence, but rather are going to say that this proposal is wrong because it's harmful.
Yeah.
It's actually disproportionately harmful towards people who are already the most vulnerable to these kinds of harm in the first place. Because it's not based in any sort of rational or reasonable policy aim, the onus is not on the people being attacked to explain, therefore, why it should not be implemented. Rather, it's a time to stand up and say, like a lot of folks have, trans folks exist and need to be respected and affirmed by every institution that affects their lives.
I just have to say one more thing, though, as the parent of a trans son and as the member of a community that was just rocked both by horrific anti-Semitic violence, but also the arrest of 11 trans activists in a protest just last week. We're at a moment in time where these policies, I do think, empower and encourage individuals who already have a great deal of animus towards trans people. And I think it emboldens them to assert control through violence. Not sure that I fully understand the logic of extremism, but what I do know is that as a parent, I'm really scared. I'm scared less of the institutional consequences of these redefinitions and more of the micro consequences of these kinds of policies and this kind of rhetoric. I'm scared about what happens when my son goes into a gas station bathroom. I'm scared that I should accompany him. I mean, all of this redefinitioning stuff is a big deal, and I don't want to minimize it at all. But what I'm really scared of is that the government is signaling that it's turning a blind eye to this community of trans people or this category of trans people, and that's making them more vulnerable.
Yeah, it is. It's a scary moment. And I think you're right to point out, especially that in some sense, there's a lot at stake, sort of administratively, but it speaks to something broader. I mean, it's something broader about the atmosphere and the climate, the question of safety. And to connect it to other, for example, that protest in Pittsburgh, right, is also stemming out of other long-standing activist goals and problems that haven't been addressed for a really long time, and forms of violence that exist every day, right, that might not have reached this level of visibility. This part does feel unprecedented, and it's actually, I think it's also unprecedented to see a pushback from sort of mainstream centrist discourse that this is a bad policy. I'm not sure if that would have happened 10 or 15 years ago. But nevertheless, that might be a bit of, it almost sounds like a silver lining, but I think you're totally right that it only happens in this context where actually there's a lot at stake and people do feel less safe and people are more scared legitimately so than they might have been 10 or 15 years ago as well.
Would you have any thoughts or any advice on what trans communities can be doing to support each other?
I can't speak for anyone's community, but I do think that a lot of the work is already being done. And a lot of that is just checking in with people in your life and making sure they're doing okay, or spending
Yeah.
time with them and venting and just, all those forms of collective kinds of care that we do when we need to anyways. And yeah, I mean, I'm not a policy expert, so I don't have prescriptions there, but I know lots of folks have been organizing to meet with the relevant representatives at the federal level who, might not be in the room making these decisions, but nonetheless, it is part of their elected position to hold the executive accountable, or at least to have input on this kind of thing. So that kind of work is definitely important. And I know there are a lot of organizations that have mobilized around this already. And I know I've been getting lots of emails from them. So it sounds like there's a lot already happening.
Yeah.
I don't think there is any one particular response that's the right one, because this really is part of a much broader moment that we're in. And so in that sense, I don't think there's any single way to respond to this, but that we really need as many responses as we can muster, since it does feel like there are attacks coming from a lot of different directions.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good response, actually.
So where can people find you and find your book?
If this made you want to read a bunch of history, although I will make a plug, not for myself in this regard, but I'm just this week myself jumping back into some new research into some archives. And I have to say, having a chance to sit with trans ancestors and the materials they left behind has actually been really calming, and I'm lucky that I'm able to take the time to do that right now. So there is a role for history right now as a kind of sharing and caring. But if you want to take a look at the book, Histories of the Transgender Child, from the University of Minnesota Press, and they have all the details on their website. Or if you want to take a look at what I'm doing on Twitter, where I'm tweeting about some of this stuff and about the book too, that's at GP Julian. That's GPJULIAN.
All right, great. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate that you're both shining a spotlight on this just as it's happening. It's a really, really important issue.
We're here today with Lorelei Lee. She is a sex worker, writer, and community organizer. Her fiction, nonfiction, and poetry have appeared or are forthcoming in Salon, The Rumpus, Wired, Denver Quarterly, the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Establishment, BuzzFeed, Spread Magazine, 1111, The Feminist Porn Book, Coming Out Like a Porn Star, and elsewhere. She owes her life to other sex workers. Welcome, Lorelei. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. We're so happy to have you.
We really wanted to talk to you about your article, Once You've Made Pornography, that you wrote for The Establishment. I have to admit that I'm nervous to ask you about it because it was so beautiful and so touching and so intense for me that I don't even know what I'm supposed to ask you about it, except to tell you that I think this is one of the most beautiful pieces of sex work writing that I've read.
Thank you. I mean, I can tell you a little bit about what generated that piece.
Yeah, that would be great.
Many, many things generated that piece of writing, but there was actually a specific thing. So there was a documentary that had been made about sex work by some folks who were anti-sex work, and they had been accused during the making of the documentary of really not honoring people's releases, sharing information about the sex workers who'd agreed to participate in the documentary process, publicly sharing information that those people had not agreed to share, and using their images in a much more broad way than they had agreed to, in ways that outed them to family members. One sex worker who had agreed to be part of the documentary later decided not to be and revoked her agreement with them, and they included her anyway.
Whoa.
Oh, wow.
So the directors, producers were asked about this. I mean, they were supposedly making a documentary about how adult film and sex work are exploitative, but by doing so, they had violated the boundaries of the sex workers whose voices they were supposedly amplifying.
Right.
And they were asked about these accusations in an interview, and they said, oh, this is what happens. This is what the adult industry does. They shut down and become defensive when anyone tries to shine a light on them.
Oh, my God.
And I got very angry when I read that interview. That's a paraphrase. I want to be clear. So I'm not naming the people who I'm talking about, and I want to be clear that that is a paraphrase. But there are links in that article to, I think that interview is linked in there.
Yeah.
And these are sentiments that we have all heard many times. And it's so infuriating when you go outside of your sex work support network and interact with civilians and do so in a way that is generous and makes you vulnerable.
Right.
And, we do it with press, we do it with friends, we do it with family, and they use those interactions to further harm us.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, of course I'm defensive of my friends.
Right.
In those situations. If we are defensive, it's because you continue to cause us harm whenever we are generous with our interactions.
Yeah, and there's something ironic about that, about doing the very thing to sex workers that they're claiming that the industry has done to them.
And almost every anti-sex work feminist analysis does this.
Right.
Yeah.
These documentaries, but also pieces of theory. And this is in almost every academic subject, right? It'll be someone's philosophy paper or sociology or whatever. And they'll use some reductive, simplified model of what they think sex work is as a construct of misogyny, right? As like a symbol of whatever the argument is that they're trying to make. But that is objectifying. That is flattening sex workers' real, complicated, lived experiences into some symbol that is for your benefit and not for ours.
Right. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who's not a sex worker, but who is a lesbian about this the other day, because she was talking about how reading queer theory is this really alienating experience where things have bubbled up from the community and then they bubble up to academia, which then spins it and changes it into something that she's like, it's not even familiar to me anymore. By the time it goes up and then comes back down, I can't relate to it. And I thought that was a really astute observation.
I am also queer and have had that experience reading queer theory where I'm like, what are they even talking about? I vaguely recognize these concepts as having been extracted from things that queer communities have said, or but being flattened into some kind of other symbolism.
Right.
This is a really thorny thing. I am not one to defend academia or much of journalism. You have to ask yourself, if these people are self-avowed feminists, this is how they interpret consent, because that's a really, really piss-poor interpretation of consent. But I do think there are some of us who are working within academia or within journalism who are trying to not abstract these conversations from the people that they immediately affect.
Yeah, but that's also different, though, because you are a part of those communities. It's different than people who are outside of those communities who are...
It is and it isn't. I think what you were saying about queer theory and queer theorists is real, though, that a lot of those folks are so insulated by their privilege and by being born into a track where, they were destined to go to some fancy school and get a fancy academic job, that even though they certainly self-identify as queer, that they're still very insulated from the real lived experience of most queers.
Yeah.
And you can't take neoliberalism out of it. You have to recognize that academia, as it exists currently, is so entrenched in the need for people to monetize their ideas.
Right.
That process of extraction, even when it's done by queer people, as you said, who are immersed in the academic project, there is this pressure for people to turn it into something that is marketable and to turns of phrase that can then be, easily consumed by people outside of those communities. Which is frustrating. I also don't think that only people within communities have ownership of queer theory or about sex work stigma.
Yeah.
And I think there is really important work being done in journalism and in academia, but it's the difference between the extractive top-down process and journalists who instead of interpreting, talk to people.
Right.
Quote
Yeah.
people, include many voices in
Right.
their project.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's sort of what I wanted to, get at in like pushing back a tiny bit, was not to really disagree or anything, but just to pose that question of what is the right way to do those things.
And I think that more often than not, the right way is, if you are a person who is working in those fields and you have access to platforms, sharing that access is one of the best ways.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. You talk a bit in your article about the fact that pornography will change your life. I mean, that's how you start the article. One of the things that you said that I think is really interesting is you talk about it in terms of stigma, almost in the language of Goffman, like as a mark. People will forever view it as part of you, so it will be part of you. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, so one thing that I've struggled with, I have been a sex worker since I was 19, and I'm 37 now, so that's 18 years.
Yeah.
And I have taken breaks from doing the work itself, there have been times when I've been burned out and gone back to like working in a coffee shop or waitressing or things like this. And I never felt like it wasn't part of me anymore.
Yeah.
I think there was a time when I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to stop doing this work and I'm going to change my relationships to the rest of the world. It's almost a trap, because there's this implication that by doing sex work, you chose to take on the stigma attached to that work. And, you chose to do the work, so you chose the stigma also.
Right.
And that isn't true, because the stigma continues to attach because you have ever done sex work.
Right. So there's no way to unchoose that, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And, we can get into the complicated question of how work gets chosen.
Right.
Which is, and I think those of us who have been doing activism for a long time have engaged in a lot of conversations about choice and sex work, and wanting to assert the ways that we have had agency and that we have chosen to do work. One important piece being that saying I am a sex worker does not mean I consent to every sex act ever, all the time, that I've waived my ability to consent, which I think is how a lot of people view sex work. And also, in trying to discern between sex work and trafficking, we often talk about that as being the difference between consensual and non-consensual labor.
Right.
But of course, it's more complicated than that. And of course, many of us, not every sex worker, but many of us chose to do the work out of a constrained number of choices.
Right.
Right.
And that's real. And we can acknowledge that, and we can talk about that, and that we haven't all loved our jobs all the time, and still defend that as being labor.
It seems actually absurd to assume that the only way in which you could have rights in your job is if you like it.
I know.
It doesn't pass the test in any other profession.
Not under capitalism, anyway.
No.
Right. Maybe in some, socialist utopia of the future, but
yeah, it's really infuriating, and it's really frustrating how this has become part of the discourse about trafficking, has gotten broader and more intense and had more political clout attached to it. I feel like in the past, or 10 years ago, people would be like, oh, you're a sex worker. Obviously, you're too traumatized to be able to have an assessment of your own life. You're so vulnerable. You're so coerced. So I can't hear anything that you have to say because I'm too busy feeling sorry for you and trying to rescue you.
Right.
And our response was, no, actually, my job is great. And there are times when I love it. And that's real, right? That has been real for me at various times. It's not true for everyone, but there are times that has been true in my life. And so those would be the times that I would emphasize in order to make people listen to me. And now the fallout from that has been that people have only heard us say, we love our jobs. We have full agency. some of us are even middle class, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
And so now the presentation is that these are the two sides. And one side is all about just sex workers who want to have the kind of sex they want to have. And the other side is victims of violence,
Right.
who are trafficking survivors, as though sex workers are not also victims of violence, as though trafficking survivors and sex workers are two discrete categories of people, as though people who call themselves sex workers have never experienced coercive working conditions
Right.
or exploitative working conditions, as though we aren't doing activism precisely because we have experienced exploitative and coercive working conditions.
Right. Yeah, it does. Going back to what you were saying earlier, it completely flattens the narrative to you either have to be this like very, very happy, fulfilled, liberated person or you're trafficked.
Yeah.
Which doesn't like allow for any nuance or actually even any real conversations about labor.
So there are a couple of things that are frustrating. One thing is, how much do we need to engage with these constructs that politicians are using and that the general public is using and the media is using in order to empower ourselves? I think there are ways that we can empower ourselves and empower our communities without engaging with those constructs, right? Like we don't even have to talk to those people in order to gather emergency funds for our friends when they face eviction, to have meetings together where we talk about ways to, collectively work for our benefit, or to understand our own lives, even to share community and share support with each other. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece of it is thinking about, well, if there are other things, that other goals that we have that we do need to engage with the media and engage with politicians in order to achieve, what are different ways of attacking that rhetoric? And one thing that I have been thinking about is how broad trafficking law has become and how it now defines many people's experiences who don't identify as trafficking survivors, but the law would see them that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Because of age or other factors.
Right, because of age, because of the way the law defines coercion, right? So, for example, in all of New York State, anyone who's arrested for prostitution goes through the Human Trafficking Intervention Court and is encouraged to describe their experiences as being coercive in order to avoid being arrested, in order to get services. They assign compulsory services instead of giving you jail time or, what the law considers punishment.
Right. We're having similar issues in Pittsburgh.
Very, very similar in Pittsburgh as well.
Right. Okay. And so one thing that I've been thinking about, and I have done a little bit of reading of like legal scholars presenting this idea, that one response to that is to talk about non-criminal law responses to trafficking. So even if we're going to say, under your definition of trafficking, some of my experiences are trafficking. I am a sex worker. I don't identify as a trafficking survivor, but under your legal construct, okay, I'll admit it fits some of my experiences.
Yeah.
But what is the response to that? It doesn't have to be arresting people. It doesn't have to be criminal law.
Right.
The response could be a similar response that we have seen in labor law, for example, in other forms of organizing that workers use, right? Collective organizing, collective empowerment, giving sex workers the tools to work together to fight exploitation. And under their legal construct, that would mean giving trafficking survivors the tools.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting idea. In Pittsburgh last week, they had a big trafficking meeting where
town hall.
Yeah, like a town hall meeting. And it was basically just a bunch of police officers and people in different government organizations who were patting themselves on the back for the great work that they've been doing to stop trafficking. And
well, the thing is, they figured out this really effective formula where they do what you were describing, constructed an overly broad definition of trafficking. They use threats and coercion to pressure people they've arrested into claiming they've been trafficked in order to avoid steeper penalties. And then they're able to both claim that trafficking is on the rise and also their policing efforts in, how many trafficking interventions they've done by showing the spike that they themselves have generated through definition and through coercion. They're able to then seek out these big pools of federal money that exist to support anti-trafficking efforts.
Absolutely. I think I want to also add to this that it's also important for us to recognize that sex workers are victims of violence, that there are people who prey on sex workers, that
absolutely.
Is sometimes, in the past when we've been trying to create this rhetoric around the difference between sex work and trafficking, we have been trying to talk about the fact that there are certainly people who are exploiting sex workers and victimizing sex workers and doing it in a commercial context. So I don't want to say that my suggestion is that all trafficking should be responded to with labor law. I mean, you have to simultaneously have a legal system that supports sex workers who are victims of violence and are looking for responses to that, and maybe even criminal law responses to that.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. That was one of the things that I was trying to get at when I started this, was that one of the questions that was asked to one of the police officers who was sitting on the panel was, well, if sex workers are victims of violence, can we come in and report violence against us without being arrested? And he skirted the question, hemmed and hawed, and then said, if you are a trafficking victim and you say you are a trafficking victim, we will not arrest you.
And this is a pervasive problem. And I have personal experience with this, with friends, just multiple experiences of this. Like, there's the one thing, which is the threat of arrest if sex workers report being victims of violence. The other thing is, even if they aren't arrested, the police will flat out refuse to investigate. And they will say, we can't investigate the rape of a sex worker. They will say that.
Right.
Yeah, and it actually made me more nervous, because my thought was, what he was basically saying is, we will arrest you lest you make these claims.
Yeah.
Part of the reason that's horrific is that often the people who get wrapped up in these then trafficking stings are actually people's support networks. So the actual caring husband or boyfriend or roommate or whatever who can be perceived as financially benefiting from the sex work that someone's doing, those are the people who often end up getting framed as traffickers, not the people who are actually doing the violence.
Yeah, I know.
And I think that's part of the deep injustice of this all. But also, it's just that, again, we're getting into these weird false dichotomies, because it's not just a dichotomy of there's sex workers who don't experience violence, and then there's trafficking victims who experience violence. There are also non-trafficked sex workers, people who, within the context of the constraints of their lives, make a choice in the way that other people make choices to do a job because it affords them maybe better opportunities than bussing tables or whatever else. And also maybe experience violence on the job, get assaulted in the back room in the club, or is forced to do something they don't consent to when they're, have an in-call or even on set at a film. And that is both violent and not necessarily trafficking. And we don't even have a way to talk about that reality that I think so many people experience, because we're so rigid in how we define these terms.
We can't talk about this without talking about the ways that race and class and gender and queerness intersect to make people not only more vulnerable, but also less visible, less accepted as deserving of bodily integrity.
Right.
Yeah.
And also overrepresented in the industry, in part because, going back to that notion of choice, I think it's important to recognize who has what choices. Choice isn't evenly distributed to begin with in our society, not even talking about the sex industry, right? So when people when you get to the point where you're deciding what job to do, people of color, women, trans folks have less choices. And in many cases, sex work is a more viable choice to pay your bills and make ends meet.
Right.
We get obsessed with choice and coercion and talking about trafficking, but it's like, what are we doing as a society to afford people equal opportunity in the first place? That never gets discussed in these conversations.
I think it's really interesting the way that middle and upper middle class white people, who generally are the ones making laws and policies, will think about something that seems to them like degrading or beneath them. And then they'll be like, well, we'll just make a prohibition against it. And that will stop that thing from happening.
Right. That makes no sense. It's completely disconnected from people's lived realities.
Yeah. And also it seems to them like a cheap solution, right? Like if we were going to talk about real solutions, we'd be talking about redistribution of wealth.
Yeah.
We'd be talking about substantive equality instead of just formal equality.
Right.
And those are conversations that would require people in positions of power to really give up a lot. I mean, instead of placing all of the cost on people who you are supposedly protecting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Choice means something very different in a world where we have a universal basic income than in the world we actually inhabit, where we have, no such thing. But nobody even wants to have that conversation.
Yeah. Well, we're having it. We're having it now. We're recording it. Other people are having it. I think it is important for us to express our frustration. It's also important for us to recognize that there is real work that is being done and
absolutely
continue to be done. Yeah. And that we're doing it.
Yeah. And I think that actually this is one of the things that I also thought was good about your article is talking about the way in which like sex worker communities are there like to support each other. I've
never felt more at home until I became out enough as a sex worker to start finding community with other sex workers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I think that's been my experience as well, actually.
I spent a lot of years feeling a lot of shame and a lot of doubt. I have to admit that I still feel it. That there are days when somebody who I thought was a civilian ally will say something that I'm going to admit this happened to me this week, like someone I really had put a lot of faith and trust in and made some remark where I was like, oh, you totally don't get it. And actually you are tokenizing me right now. And there's this double feeling of feeling both underestimated and unworthy. That is the worst.
Yeah. No, I know. Actually, PJ and I had this conversation last night because I was saying that there's this really weird thing that happens where people who are outside of sex work almost attach to me. I can only speak from my own experience, like attach to me for this sort of like, oh, you're doing cool and edgy things, but then will say things that make it clear that they're also putting me at like an arm's length. And I think that that's really hard to take, especially when you don't realize it's happening and you assume that somebody's a friend of yours and that they are allies. And then you're like, wait, they're making sure that you're at a distance, but close enough that they get some sort of cachet for having a sex worker friend.
And that can be so painful. And, it also can have real impact. I, have had plenty of experiences of exclusion, of, not being allowed in various places, both in academia and in family situations. And so there's material impact from that, right?
Right.
But there's also emotional impact. So for a lot of years when I was younger, there were times when I could go to a very dark emotional place and, certainly struggled with depression at times and struggled with knowing whether my life had value at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that is one of the reasons I wrote this piece, is because the way that I survived those experiences was by being friends with other sex workers and by seeing other sex workers have similar experiences and being like, oh, wait a minute, that's not fair.
Yeah.
And I know that person, and I know that person is brilliant and full of integrity and creative and smart and like valuable in caring in so many ways.
Yeah.
Like a fully just valuable human being
Yeah.
with all the dignity that that entails. And that they're getting like rejected by their family or told that they're garbage by their boyfriend or, you know, kicked out in the middle of the night or told by the police that their rape can't be investigated.
Yeah.
That I can see clearly is not okay because it's not me experiencing it, right? It's harder to know that for yourself than it is to know that for other people. So in addition to feeling loved and supported and accepted by other sex workers in a way that I had not felt in other places at all ever, also there was this process of it's easier sometimes to know when something is unfair for someone else than it is to know that it's not their fault.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Than it is to know that it's not your fault.
Right.
You know?
I kind of felt that way with family stuff. You start to feel really like turned around in your own family dynamics. But then when you hear your friends say that they've had similar experiences, you're like, wait, no, that's fucked up. They shouldn't treat you like that.
And then you're like, they did the same thing to me.
And then you're like, wait, they shouldn't treat me like that either.
Yeah.
And then and then you can kind of set better boundaries.
And your friends will tell you your parents shouldn't treat you like that, or your boyfriend shouldn't treat you, or your girlfriend, whatever. Like, they will also help you know that and hear that. Yeah. And also won't downplay it, which is something I find civilians do a lot. That I'll describe some experience of sex work stigma, of being rejected, of someone saying something shitty to me, of being discriminated against. And civilians will say, oh, but that couldn't be because you're a sex worker.
Oh,
or
right.
like,
in the same way that white people do to people of color.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yes. And they'll be like, I'm sure they didn't mean it. I'm sure whatever. The other thing is you'll be like, no, this has actually happened like 100 times.
Right.
So that's how I can recognize it.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, that kind of thing never happens. Like it's this whole world of interactions they've never seen before.
I know. I remember one time I was talking to my dad. This isn't about sex work, but it's the same structure, and it almost made me crazy, and I'll never forget this. We were just chatting one day, and he said, you know, workplace discrimination based on gender doesn't happen anymore. I've never seen it. The fact that he's never seen it, he thought was evidence of the fact that it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And that made me so crazy.
You're like, I've never not seen it.
No.
Yeah.
I've never, ever been in an environment where I wasn't put down or discredited or
treated as the in-house
over-sexualized
therapist
or harassed. Or, I mean, that happens to cisgendered femme women in every single workplace that they are in.
And trans femmes and femmes of all genders.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that there's a willful not seeing that allows people in positions of privilege to maintain that and to not interrogate themselves.
Yeah.
Not express any empathy when like an entire group of people, when everyone you talk to has these universal experiences stemming from a certain background.
Especially straight, white, cis men, you know, and obviously we bag on them a lot, but one thing that I think is true is that the world that we live in, the United States, is constructed in such a way that all the laws and all the media and all of the positions of power were created by and for straight cis white men. I'm not a straight cis white man, so I can't really say that I know what their experience is, but it seems like they just it gets affirmed again and again that their experience is the normal one, is the default. If anyone is experiencing something different, that is considered a anomaly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. That's my read too, and I'm also not a cis white man, so it's maybe unfair, but that's how I feel it.
And I think sometimes queer people of color, like, have just a lot more practice, even in just watching mainstream narratives. Like, you grow up with books and movies that center straight, white, middle class, upper middle class voices, and
Right.
you are supposed to empathize with those characters in order to go to the movie theater.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? Yeah, you just have to learn that. You have to learn to step outside of yourself, even just to like consume media in the world, and of course, other people don't have to do that necessarily. So,
yeah, I was a judge in a film festival, and a queer film festival, and actually, it was a gay cis white man, but we were like, I was on like a panel of judges, and he was like, yeah, the movie that there was another woman on the panel, and we wanted to award the prize to this movie, this short film by a Chilean filmmaker, and he was like, yeah, I just think this is a women's story. And we were like, okay, but like, so what? So that means that its reach is narrower than men's stories. I mean, what he was saying essentially was that men's stories have broad audience.
I had a very similar experience one time when I was in a class on Freud. It was a Freud class, and we were talking about sexual development, and I read a lot in Freud's History of Sexuality about female sexual development, and I asked a question about it in class, and the professor looked at me and he was like, we're actually only talking about Freud's universal concepts in this class.
Oh my God.
Which means his theory of men, of course.
That's like women's bodies. Like, what do we don't really care about women's bodies. He's the same person who also made the claim in class that the clitoris was discovered in the 90s, like the 1990s. Full circle back to like the disconnect in academia. I lost my mind.
Wow. Yeah.
That whole universalization of male experience.
Oh, I mean, you just reminded me of in graduate school in a class, I tried to talk about this exactly, because we're reading short stories, and he was like, it was like a Lori Moore story, whatever. She writes a lot about like straight romance and being a straight cis woman of a middle class background. And he was like, the reason this story is so good is because it really describes the female experience. And I was like, dude. And I got so mad, and I like stayed after class. I had a long conversation with him, and he had like some award from some LGBT organization that I will not name, that he was like, I have this award, so I am not. And I was like, okay, fine, cool, but let me just explain to you why this is not like the universal female experience,
right?
For a million reasons, in a million ways.
Yeah. As if there is a universal female experience. Yeah,
exactly. But then after that in class, he kept being like, anytime there was like a queer character in a story, he'd be like, and Lorelei, what do you have to say about this?
Oh my God.
Address our resident queer.
Oh my God, that's like,
yeah. At one point I told him, I am done talking to you. Like in class, in front of everybody.
Good for you.
Wow. That's so awful.
Yeah, it can be really, really bad.
Yeah.
One of the things that you said that I thought that actually resonated with me too is that the further that you get into sex work, but also into sex work communities, the harder it is to talk to people outside of that for all of the reasons that we've suggested already.
Yeah. It's so real. And, doing community organizing and activist work and various other projects, I have been doing more interacting with civilians in a variety of ways, and I still find it hard.
Yeah.
I find it so hard. I mean, this is not to say that I don't have civilian friends who are really wonderful people, and I do have civilian friends who I've known for a number of years who have advanced understandings of like what sex work stigma is, and
right.
It's not difficult to spend time with those people But anyone, who I have known for a shorter amount of time or who has less experience just interacting with sex workers, it can feel like it is constantly an educational project,
right,
rather than a friendship or you just can't be vulnerable.
And here's the thing. I was thinking a lot about this semester because I started teaching again for the first time in a long time. And I mean, part of the reason that I got hired is because I have a sex work background and there's not that in the department. But that's hard to negotiate because it's so heavily stigmatized. And also you learn so much from sex work. It's really difficult to translate that information across stigma.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a structure in which it actually is supposed to be educational, but even then, it's so much that I tend to avoid even going down that path because you'd have to do so much.
Because it is the part of your expertise. But I do want to just mention that you got hired in part because of your sex work background. That's thrilling to me. I know it's tokenizing and in a lot of ways, and I'm sure it's difficult, but also I am excited to hear that. The fact that they care about having someone in the department working on that, I think that is a sign of progress.
Yeah, I think it is too.
Well, I don't want to be too grateful for small, obviously this is a sex work experience is a body of knowledge, contains a body of knowledge, and should be recognized as such. But
I totally agree, and I
it's
also
pretty
think
life-changing for us.
Yeah, I also think that it's a bigger body of knowledge than all of the stuff that I did, academically before I got into sex work, and so I do feel like it's more of an expertise, but it's so tricky.
Well, and relevant to your piece, I think, one of the things that we've had to wrestle with is disclosure. So we've both taken the tack of disclosing up front that we've worked in the industry because, like you describe in your piece, you make these complicated calculations every time you enter a new social situation. And I think we're both there is no way with 20 or sometimes 40, internet savvy students in our classroom that we are not going to get outed eventually. But it makes everything really complicated then because you have to worry about the potential blowback from that and discussions of things being sexualized. And
you just have to negotiate things that other people don't have to negotiate.
Yes. And also, by having outed yourself, people say, oh, well, they wouldn't have treated you that way if you hadn't told them. Not only do you then have to negotiate the stigma, but also you get blamed for that stigma being enacted upon you because you outed yourself. When you're just taking a tiny amount of control that you can take in that moment.
Yeah, and we feel like we have to do that because we've been in the other situation that you also describe where people are sending our links to family members and passing them around, and it becomes this freak show that everybody loses their shit over. And
personally, I just like to get out in front of that and say, I don't consent to you doing that. So it's crystal clear. And everything can be used as evidence against you, right? And you've experienced this, I know, Jesse, but everything is, well, you wore that shirt that was too low. You did this, you did, you're stuck in a situation where you're always going to be sexualized and accused of sexualizing, no matter how much you work to proactively limit that.
Yeah, that's what stigma does.
Yeah, right.
Right? It's and no matter what kind of stigma we're talking about, it's there is this idea that oppressed people are supposed to mitigate stigma, do the work to mitigate stigma. But meanwhile, it's just enacted against you no matter what you do.
Right.
So it's you're blamed either way.
Yeah, it's so complicated.
And also so real.
Yeah, I do. I think going back to what you said earlier, though, it is important to have these conversations. It's important to record them. It's important for people who are open to hear them and to hear what sort of impact this has on real people.
Yeah, and I think that conversations are one of the most powerful tools. I mean, this is the upside of outing yourself, is that you aren't going to change everyone, but you're going to give people some exposure so that the next time they meet someone who's a sex worker, they're going to be a little more experienced with that next person.
Yeah.
Like whatever that looks like. And sometimes it can go really far. I mean, one thing that we, as queers have learned is that outing ourselves over the course of several decades meant letting people know that people they already loved were queer.
Right.
And that can be a transformative experience
Yeah.
for people. And I have found that when I've outed myself at specific times, that people have had a transformative experience of thinking they never would ever meet someone who was a sex worker, right? And then you're like, actually, I was in your life this whole time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that can be really powerful too. But I mean, obviously, because we run a podcast where we tell stories, and I'm a writer and I like to do the same thing. And to me, I think telling stories and humanizing people is really important. And really, I think it's really political.
Absolutely. Yeah. Storytelling definitely is a political tool.
I just wanted to completely change the subject and maybe lighten the mood for a minute and acknowledge that it is October and Halloween season is upon us. And I would like to ask you about your experience making X-Files parodies and other fantastical pornography, but
Cool.
particularly your X-Files parody.
Well, I used to have the great honor of directing a gangbang website where we would hire cis female performers primarily and say, what would you like your gangbang fantasy storyline to be? And they would write back and say what they wanted their fantasy to look like. So I got to make those happen. And, we did X-Files, we did a lot of typical storylines like Motorcycle Gang and that kind of thing. But actually, I got to do this on a number of other websites too, of just creating storylines with access to a shop department that would build props. So I got to do Barbarella XXX, the parody. You guys, I don't know if Barbarella is a thing you guys are into.
I mean, I'm familiar with it. But I think it's awesome that you got a shop that was making you props. That's amazing.
Totally. Yes, it was amazing. I have learned since I made that parody that it's not actually a cultural touch point for a lot of people my age or younger. I mean, it is before my time too. But it was Jane Fonda, and she was a space traveler, and it was a dystopic future type storyline. But so I got to build a spaceship and dress up in really amazing, wacky costumes. I mean, just Google Barbarella. Her costumes are really beautiful. A pink spaceship with fur lines. It was all fur lines. Yeah, and we get to go to different planets and have sex on them.
That was PJ's favorite part of the Hacking Hustling panel, was hearing you talk about your porn parodies.
Oh my God. I mean, this is what, when I talk about having done sex work under conditions that gave me great joy, I mean, that's it. Being able to work with creative performers, and make other people's fantasies into some kind of film vision.
Yeah.
That's not really how kind of mainstream narratives about porn production go, right? I think people have this casting couch vision or whatever, but the idea of collaborating in advance, developing someone's fantasy, I think that's all really interesting.
Actually, what I think is an important thing I should say is that Juliet March is the performer whose X-Files parody it was.
Oh,
I want to give her, I need to give her name her, give her credit for that. So that was at kink.com, and I'm not sure how much they get to do that. anymore. I shouldn't say, because I don't work there anymore and I don't know what they're doing. But
Right.
But we had a lot of resources for a brief period of time, and then those resources didn't exist anymore. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And that was true at that company, but it was also true at a lot of other companies that I have worked for, that there was sort of like this time in the early 2000s and the 2005, 2006, 2007, when adult film companies who were sort of like there for the dawn of the internet, right? The beginning of websites being a place that you could monetize, and riding that crest by being like earlier adopters of technology.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so having a huge influx of resources to do big, creative, beautiful projects like that. And then, of course, being subject to the same pirating and other, and also, I mean, so there's like the downside, which is pirating that really ate into people's income. But there's the upside, which is that the means of production was just in the hands of so many more people. So
Right.
you got clips for sale, you got all of these ways that individual performers could do content trades and create our own work that wasn't through a production company.
Right.
That was often done with fewer resources, and also is maybe taking some of the market away from those big companies. And that's not a bad thing. That's a really good thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's definitely like pretty rich cosplay and all sorts of just, interesting things going on those clip sites. Like it's pretty fruitful place of creativity at the moment, even in spite of all those market pressures and the pirating and everything else.
And I do think actually that as performers have had greater access to the means of production, we're creative people, like, and also because you're selling your work on a more individual basis and like able to do customs and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Like, there's actually been a huge broadening of the type of content that's being created.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
yeah.
It's not the big budget productions that were happening before, but maybe that doesn't matter at all.
Yeah. But there's a lot of really like interesting and creative work that's happening.
Exactly.
What we're calling big budget is small budget compared to, other film industries, right? So it's...
Yeah, I know, that is kind of hilarious.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm
it's...
like, budget, because we spent like $5,000.
Right. Which...
And in Hollywood, they're like, the $1 million movie is a low budget production.
Right, exactly. Like that was their lunch budget for like one day, right?
And when performers can create our own content, like we can combat the white supremacist, able-bodied, thin, cis, blonde female paradigm or whatever of the traditional porn view, like the traditional understanding of what is marketable, which is such a lie.
Yeah. I think that's also a really good point. Where can people find your work?
Right now, I am working on several very long-term projects. So mostly I don't have a lot of output that's really accessible, but I do have a piece coming out in 11/11 in November, an essay, and you can find me on Twitter at Miss Lorelei Lee.
All right, great. Thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.